Jewish Center of Wyoming, together with my wife, Razy. It is wonderful to see familiar faces and a pleasure to welcome those of you who are joining us for the very first time. Our mission at the Chabad Jewish Center of Wyoming is to share the beauty of Jewish tradition, history, wisdom, education, and Torah with the Jewish community of Wyoming and beyond. Most importantly, and I say this all the time because it's true, now more than ever, it is important that we do these events to bring together the unity within our community. A few housekeeping items before we begin our interview with Rabbi Zippel. First, I would like to share with you two of our upcoming events. Please mark your calendars. These are going to be fantastic. This Thursday, June 18th at 7:30 p.m. Mountain Standard Time, we're going to be hosting Dr. David Laz, Richard Green, and Paul Chandler to talk about the work that they did in the aftermath of the 1991 horrific riots that took place in the Crown Heights section of Brooklyn, and how they were able to bring together the Jewish and Black community during that time. They will also be sharing suggestions of what can be done nowadays during these challenging times to bring unity into a world which desperately needs it. On Sunday, June 21st at 7:30 p.m. Mountain Standard Time, we'll be hosting a Farbrengen in honor of the Rebbe's Yahrzeit, which is coming up next week on Wednesday. This event will be Sunday, June 21st, 7:30 p.m. We're going to be hosting the one and only Rabbi Shlomo Kunin, Director of Chabad of California. It will be thought-provoking, entertaining, interesting, an event you don't want to miss. The schedule this evening will begin with a 30-minute interview with Rabbi Avremi Zippel, which will be conducted by Razy. During the 30-minute interview, please send in your questions in the chat box that you would like Rabbi Zippel to answer today. If you're tuning in on Facebook, let us know where you're tuning in from and add your questions on Facebook, which we will be monitoring to include in the overall dialogue and discussion that we are having. Please do not send in questions that are partisan, over-sexualized in nature. We at Chabad believe in including everyone and hope that this event brings our entire community together. After the formal interview is over, we will ask as many questions that are submitted in the chat box as we can. As you all know, now more than ever, our community is struggling with the after effects of coronavirus. Many people still have not returned to work. People have called us and continue to call us every single day asking for life support during this time. We are doing our very best to bring packages of food on a daily basis to many families in our community and in the broader community. Your support now is vitally important to ensure that we can support the most desperate in our community during this challenging time. Please consider making a one-time tax-deductible contribution at jewishwyoming.com/donate to help people who are struggling in a dignified way. Please make sure that you direct it to the Rabbi's discretionary funds. We are deeply honored that Rabbi Zippel has accepted our invitation to share his story of courage, hope, and faith. He is not charging our community. If you'd like to donate to Rabbi Zippel's causes, please be in touch with him about that. Ask that question. We will include a link for his donation page. Please consider doing that. Rabbi Zippel is a dear friend who we know for 13 years. He is a Utah-raised rabbi serving the local community in Salt Lake City since 2014. In February 2019, Rabbi Zippel courageously testified about the decade of childhood sexual abuse he endured at the hands of his family's babysitter as part of the criminal proceedings against her. His testimony made him the first Orthodox rabbi to ever speak out publicly on such a sensitive topic and sparked his career as an advocate and activist for survivors of sexual abuse around the world. Rabbi Zippel is a program director, youth director, the director of the YJP, Young Jewish Professionals, and a spiritual leader at the Chabad Center of Utah, together with his wife, Shana, and two beautiful children. It is my great pleasure to welcome Rabbi Zippel and invite Razy to conduct this evening's interviews. Please put your hands together for our guest of honor, Rabbi Zippel.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
So, Rabbi Zippel, you grew up in Salt Lake City after the Rebbe of blessed memory sent your parents there as to serve as the Chabad Rabbi in Rebbitzin in the Salt Lake City community. Tell us a little bit about your parents' work and what life was like growing up as a child in the rabbi's home.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me, Rabbi and Razy. It's an honor to be with your community. I wish that I could have been there in person. My wife and I were fortunate enough to spend Shabbos in Jackson a couple of years ago. I want to say it was 2016, and we definitely hope to make it back at some point. And thank you all for tuning in. I hope so. Thank you all for tuning in, and I appreciate the opportunity to share with all of you tonight. So my parents moved here to Salt Lake City in the summer of 1992. Next month will be 28 years ago to set up a Chabad headquarters for, at that point, which was probably the last big stretch of the United States that did not have a formal Chabad presence. They set up shop in Salt Lake City, and they brought me along for the ride. The first Chabad event that took place here in the state of Utah was my first birthday party. And yeah, I grew up in the family business. I'm the oldest of six. And I guess got accustomed to the reality, which I'm sure the Rabbi and Razy relate to, that growing up with your parents on the job is a very immersive experience. You know, my parents did not leave their work at the office. In fact, I think it's pretty fair to say that as a Chabad Rabbi in Rebbitzin, there really is no home and office. You know, it's a life dedicated to service. And as such, that was the experience and the life that I grew up in. You know, it was something which I was very fortunate to have that as part of my reality. It was something which I wanted to be a part of myself. From a very, very young age, the idea of giving to others and living a life of commitment to others' spiritual well-being was something which was fascinating and alluring to me from a very, very young age. And it was something which I knew I wanted to do one day. And, you know, fast forward a couple of years later, I am fortunate to have that life. And I work here in the Chabad for my parents together with my wife, as the Rabbi mentioned, for almost 6 years now. But it was, you know, it's in a certain sense, it's baptism by fire. It's, you know, it's the inculcation into a lifestyle very quickly from a very young age, and you get thrown in, you know, head first. And I'm very fortunate for that, and I tremendously appreciated it.
Well, I'm glad to see that you're so happy, and maybe what we're doing with our children isn't bad.
I think so.
So as a parent, we homeschool our children. We have 6. Would love to hear from your perspective of what it was like to grow up being homeschooled as the oldest of 6 children.
So it's been interesting, especially, you know, the Rabbi mentioned is where we find ourselves. Up until recently, I was saying the tail end of the Corona experience. Somehow it feels like we're still in the middle. We haven't really gotten to the tail yet. But it's been interesting going through Corona and so many families here in town sharing with me, you know, how difficult it is to have the kids home all day. That was my life for my entire childhood. I mean, when we say we were homeschooled, we were quite literally homeschooled. We went to school in the home. There is no and was no formal Jewish educational infrastructure here in Salt Lake City. And so we went to school at home. We were educated by my parents and another gentleman who helped in our education, but we were home all day, every day.
I just want to interrupt you and say that for all those that know us, we homeschool. Our kids go to an online Jewish school that's at home. But when Avremi grew up, this was before the times of the online school. So when he says that he was homeschooled, he was very much taught in a classroom in his house by his mother, and like he said, somebody else. So really, kudos to
and I think the real functional difference was also the lack of the social interactions. You know, I know that my nieces and nephews and very soon my own kids will go to, you know, online school like the Mendelssohns, and they have a virtual class, albeit virtual, but, you know, on a daily basis they're interacting over a screen with a number of kids, and as all of us big adults professionals have been doing for the past 3 months now, you know, Zoom calls like we're doing now, and there is that social component. We didn't have that as kids. You know, we were kind of raised on an island in a certain sense. You know, there were kids in the community that we had friendships and relationships with, but we were home a whole day. You know, we had each other. The first three of us boys, are bunched pretty closely together, and you know, nature gives you your first friends in the forms of siblings, and you know, that was our experience, and that was kind of, you know, the only life we knew. We didn't know an alternative. We didn't know what it meant to go to school. When I was in fourth grade, I had good friends who were living in Vegas. At that point, they had just opened a Jewish day school in Vegas, and they invited me to come out and see what it was like to sit behind a desk and have a teacher and homework and, you know, a functional school setting from 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. And it was, I tell you, it was the strangest thing in the world. But, you know, that was what we had to get accustomed to. And each one of us, we all left home after bar bat mitzvah to go pursue a more full-time Jewish education in a city where there was a proper infrastructure. And yeah, that was us. That's what we did.
Okay, thank you. Do you want to talk a little bit before we get into the topic of pressing charges, a little bit about getting sexually abused, or should we go straight into pressing charges?
So no, we can set the table a little bit. In 1998, my youngest brother was born, who's number 5 in the family, 5 of 6, and my parents had, you know, 5 kids at home all day. My dad was usually out and about doing whatever it is that day needed a Chabad rabbi to do. You know, Chabad rabbis wear many hats, and most of them are out of the house. And my mom had a lot of kids at home. And so at that point, I was just about 7 years old. My parents decided to get full-time childcare, an assistant, a nanny at home to kind of be an extra pair of hands around the house. My parents hired someone in the community, which came very highly recommended. And about a year later, in September of 1999, she began sexually abusing me. You know, this happened once, it happened twice, it happened a dozen times, and it went on. It went on for about a decade. It did, at 18, just the family dynamics had changed a little bit, and my parents didn't need full-time help anymore, and so she was no longer in my parents' employ. But for those 10 years, it went on pretty consistently. I did leave home at 13. I wasn't at home, you know, every day, all day. I would come home 4 or 5 times a year for the Chagim, for Jewish holidays, happy occasions, whatever it was, and then the abuse would continue. And this became, you know, the childhood and the you know, the teen years that I knew. It was my experience, and you know, with the overwhelming flood of emotions that, you know, are usually associated with such an experience. I think for me, the most dominant emotion was one of fear. I didn't want anyone to know about it. I wasn't up for talking about it. I didn't want to share it with anybody. And so I kept it my secret for a very, very long time, up until about 4 years ago, a little bit longer, in 2016. I was struggling, I guess, for lack of a better term. A lot of the issues that childhood trauma brings with it were, you know, really bubbling up to the surface, and were not going away. And at the urging of my parents and my wife, I went to see a therapist, a mental health professional, and I told him what I had suspected was the case. And I remember saying to him specifically, I think that I was sexually abused by my nanny. In my frame of reference, I didn't really know what sexual abuse was, or the concept of consent or anything like that. And I began to get the help that I needed. You know, we began to have very, very fundamental conversations that I probably should have had a long time before that. But he set me on the path. He set me on the path of healing, and he gave me the tools to start, you know, working on things that I really needed to work on. And, you know, he definitely, I'd say he gave me the tools to begin recovery and to begin this eternal process that I think survivors of childhood trauma go through, of recovery and dealing with what we've been through and finding place for that in our lives.
Wow, so difficult, very painful. So as you're going through trying to heal and trying to recover, you press charges, what caused you, what made you decide to pursue justice, and what challenges did you experience during this process?
So I had, once I was in counseling, and once I really began to understand the nature of what had happened to me as a child, I think the notion of justice was one that I had always entertained. I think for me, the greatest impediment in making the decision to pursue justice was my overwhelming desire at that point to preserve my anonymity. And I wasn't really sure how that would work. If I would go to the cops and they would open a case, what would that mean for me? I didn't want anybody to know about it. So, you know, what would that mean for my identity? Would I be able to keep it a secret? How would all that work? And I think for me, you know, the stigma of being a survivor of sexual abuse was something which weighed on me very heavily and really prevented me from making that decision to go forward. In 2017 and 18, obviously the Me Too movement, you know, came to life, and a lot of people of all shapes and sizes and forms and colors and across the spectrum of humanity began to speak out about their, you know, their experiences with sexual abuse and sexual trauma. And frankly, it was inspiring, and it was refreshing to see people be willing to speak so openly about that. And in January of 2018, I went to the police. I'd say that, you know, Razy, you asked about the challenges along the way. I think I got a very rude awakening and a quick education into the process of our justice system. And it, you know, the wheels turned very slowly. And as the rabbi mentioned earlier, in February 2019, it finally came got to a hearing. I testified against my abuser, and this past November, about 9 months ago at this point, she stood trial for 7 felonies. The jury convicted her on all counts, and that was kind of the end of that process. What changed for me primarily, though, was the decision to go public. And in fact, in February of last year, when I testified, I made the decision to let that story be covered in the local paper, and from there it went to wherever it went. And I embraced that. I embraced being a survivor of sexual abuse in a public sense, and not just embraced it, but I decided to make a life's work out of helping others in a similar situation.
Incredible. So taking your challenges and your pain and really using it to help others is very special.
Thank you.
You said that you encountered challenges from the legal system and the justice system. Were there other challenges that you encountered along the way of opening up and sharing your story? Where it was everybody like okay and accepting, everybody believed you right away? I know often people are afraid to talk because maybe some people won't believe them or people will blame them or whatnot. Did you encounter any other?
So it's a great question, and it's a question which I'll divide the answer to 2 halves. For me, I'd start with the bigger issue though, and then I'll kind of come back to some of the points you brought up. For me, there was a very, very pivotal moment for me in this process of deciding to come forward. And that was shortly before I went to the police. I remember sitting down one night and racking my brain and wondering who I could ask about this. I was very hesitant about going to the cops. And what I was looking for in my Rolodex, as it were, was, you know, who is someone that I could talk to who is an observant Jew, preferably who's in Chabad circles, who is a male survivor of sexual abuse. There's got to be somebody. And I thought about it and thought about it and thought about it and thought about it and Googled it and you know, performed all sorts of research that I could. And I literally came up with nothing. And all at once, that was a very sad moment, but it was an oddly inspiring moment as well, because it really gave me the opportunity to think, you know, if no one has done this until now, and there's so many people that are looking for someone like this to come forward, maybe that's your job. Maybe instead of wallowing in the misery of thinking, you know, woe is me, I have no one to talk to, maybe the situation is yours for the taking to be that voice and to be that presence that so many people could benefit from in their own lives. And so that was, you know, a large concern on my part was the Orthodox community ready for this? Was the Chabad community ready for this? You know, was this going to be brushed under the rug? Was I going to be shastilled, or were we ready to have that conversation? And the response has been, you know, nothing but remarkable and welcoming and loving. To your other question, you know, are people going to believe me? What are people going to say? What are people going to think? I think that is a thought process that, as a survivor of sexual abuse, you never really go away from. You constantly are anxious about, you know, people's judgments, and you know, what opinions of you they're forming in their own minds when they find that out, and what do they think, and how do they perceive it? And, you know, for me, the process was one of recognition that that's probably never going to go away. And, you know, there was a certain phase where I had to come to grips with the fact that if I'm okay with me, then everyone else can be okay with me. And if they're not, they're not. I know that I'm okay with myself, and you know, that's really what I need to press on with life. And so that was, for me, that was kind of the very fundamental recognition.
And you always had such a great and healthy self-confidence, or is this something that with your therapist you were able to really build up within yourself and really to enable you to be able to go public and be okay with it?
The short answer is absolutely not.
Get back to the
I think that for many survivors of childhood trauma, that self-confidence is a constant battle. You know, even today, after God knows how many people know my story, I think for me it's still a constant struggle. You know, I'll meet someone and they'll get to know me as a rabbi, as a human being, you know, as someone who's quote unquote normal, someone who doesn't have any sort of history. And in conversation, it'll come up, you know, oh, I was sexually abused as a child, and instantly, you know, I'll stare at their face and I'll watch the wheels turn in their head, you know, and I'll watch their pupils dilate for a moment, and I'll see how they go through that, and my heart will start racing, even today, even after, you know, how many, I don't know, tens of thousands of people know the story at this point, and it's just one more person, but you know, I think that ability to accept yourself and to give yourself a pass to be okay regardless of what people think, I think for people like me is a constant battle, and one that, you know, one needs to remain mindful of on a very, very regular basis.
Wow. Okay, so while we're talking about your healing process, what role did God play in your healing?
So God and I have had a very interesting relationship over the years. You know, as I think back on the years that, you know, this has all gone on, for me, a large part of the secondary trauma that went on in my life was, you know, not just what was actually happening, but what was happening in my own head as a result of that. And so for many, many, many years, I was convinced that everything that had happened to me as a child was absolutely, you know, without question, my fault, or at the very least, it was 50% my fault and 50% her fault. But there was a lot of guilt that lay at my feet. And as a result of that, I was pretty convinced that God hated me. Yeah, I had a pretty firm understanding of that, and that was tough. It was tough to live with that as a child and as a teen. You know, to make peace with the fact that God hates you and you're engaging in such immoral behavior. Then I went to therapy, and I discovered that what had happened to me was, you know, really textbook childhood sexual abuse. And so, and it wasn't my fault. You know, it was not my fault in any way. And so when that happened, that set me on a very different road with God. And instead of God hating me, I turned to God, and I was, you know, it really kind of set up the questions in my head of what kind of God lets that happen. You know, if you're telling me that this is not something which I did, it's something which happened to me without any guilt to be heaped on me, how are you okay with that, God? What kind of God sits by and watches children get abused and is okay with that on some level? And that was kind of the second, you know, phase in our process. And I think lastly, I consider myself very fortunate that I've come to a certain place where I can understand that some good has come of this. You know, I consider myself very lucky to have been through something in life where I can see a very, very, very definitive and strong silver lining to the cloud. And as such, I'm very fortunate, you know, that God has allowed me to do that. And I think we have a very good relationship at this point, in the sense that I understand, or I hope to understand, and I try to understand why certain things happen and the purpose that lays within them, and try to make something better of it. And I think that's all you really can do when you go through something like that in life. And I'd say right now we're at a very good place. And in fact, you know, my relationship with God has been probably the greatest source of strength and comfort to me through my healing process, and has given me hope, and has given me you know, the courage to press on. And for me, it's a huge benefit right now, though it wasn't always that way.
Wow, how empowering, and what strength. So now, as a rabbi and as a father of two beautiful, really gorgeous little boys, and as a human being, what do you think you yourself or other parents could do to help prevent their children from sexual abuse predators?
So that's an excellent question, and one that I get very often, and very often when I'll get that question in one-on-one contact with other Chabad rabbis and rebbitzins, members of my community, human beings, and they'll say, you know, what can we do what can we do to make sure that our children are not exposed to pedophiles? A lot of people will get very discouraged by my answer, and the answer is nothing. Short of locking your children in a closet in your home and, you know, encasing them in bubble wrap, there's really nothing you can do to guarantee that your child will not cross the path of someone who wishes them harm. Pedophiles come in all shapes and sizes, and they have all sorts of employments and backgrounds, and you know, they take up a great many roles in life. And I firmly believe that there's nothing a parent can do to guarantee their child will not encounter a pedophile at some point in their life. What a parent can do and should do, I think what I've learned from my story, is create an environment where you empower your child to never, ever feel any sort of hesitation to discuss anything with you as a parent. And I'll very often share with people who I have this conversation with in a one-on-one setting, the few times a year that I would have social interaction with other kids my age was during the summer. We'd go to summer camp, sleepaway camp in the Catskills. And before we'd go to camp, you know, on the way to the airport, this was, you know, the only time all year that we really engaged with other kids and other adults outside of my parents' supervision. And my parents would have the same conversation with me every year. You know, if your counselor or someone in camp hurts you, you know, is violent with you in some way, physically harms you, and they tell you that you can't tell anybody and you should be scared of them, don't be. You know, call us up the next morning and remember that your dad is stronger than whoever it is in camp that's threatening you, and he'll get on the first flight out there and punch the guy in the face and rescue you from their clutches. So don't be afraid of anybody else, you know, being stronger than your mom and dad. And I got that. I accepted that. So if I would have been in camp and one night my counselor would have taken me out of the bunkhouse and taken me out on the porch and whacked me across the face and told me not to tell anybody or he'd do it again, I would know what to do in that situation. I would call my parents and tell them what had happened, and I would be protected. What happened if my counselor had taken me out of the bunkhouse in the middle of the night and taken me on the porch and given me $100 bill? Just slipped me a $100 and said to me, "This is yours to keep." It's a lot of money for a child. It's yours to keep, and you can hold on to it so long as you don't tell anybody about this exchange. If you do, I'll have to take the money back. But if you don't, not only can you keep this, but I'll give you another $100 in a week from now. We have a deal? Go back to bed. In that moment, I'm not protecting my counselor's secrecy. I'm protecting my own secret. I have an invested interest in this story never reaching anybody's ears because I have skin in the game. I benefit from the story by holding on to this money. And so I'm protecting my own secret by not wanting anybody to find out about it. I think when a lot of children experience sexual trauma or childhood trauma in any way, they often feel that it's their fault. And so therefore, the person whose secret they're protecting is not their abuser's secret. It's their own secret. They feel that if anyone would really know the truth about what they had experienced, they would be the one who would get punished. They would suffer the consequences for what had happened. And I think the message that we can share with our children is there's never anything in your life that you go through as a child that you should ever feel compelled to keep a secret from your parents. And on the contrary, if there is an experience which compels you to keep a secret from your parents, that should be the greatest indication that you should be telling your parents. And I think that's really, you know, that's where we can make a difference in this arena. I believe that the difference between a child being, you know, touched inappropriately or being abused in any way once or twice, there's a huge line between that once and twice or multiple times. And I think giving the children the ability to speak up after that happens, God forbid one time, makes a world of a difference.
Wow, lots of process. If you could talk to your 8-year-old self that was being abused, what would you tell him?
So that's a great question. It's one that I've gotten a lot recently. I actually, in March, a couple months ago, actually, like literally the eve of Corona was the second to last day the courthouse here in Salt Lake City was opened. I had the opportunity to read a statement to the court at my abuser's sentencing. And in that statement, amongst a number of other things that I said, I read a letter before the court to the child, to my 8-year-old self, exactly as you said it, Razy. And I think for me, what was most important to convey to my 8-year-old self in that moment was I apologized. I apologized to my 8-year-old self. I knew that as a teen and as a young adult and into my adult years, I had born a tremendous amount of animosity and resentment and some very negative feelings towards that child for, in my understanding at that point, having done what he had done. And I apologized for that. And I committed myself to fighting for that small child every single day for the rest of my life, which I feel is really all you can do when you hope to rebound from such an experience.
Wow. Okay, well, studies showed that sexual predators were often abused themselves as children, and then they continue the inexcusable cycle of abuse on others. From your perspective, how would you encourage those who have been abused to break the cycle of pain? And is there any room for compassion for child sexual predators?
Wow, so that's a pretty heavy question. I'm going to split that into two, if I may, because I think it touches on two very different points, and they both equally deserve attention. So I want to speak about breaking that cycle of violence, because as you say, statistics show that people who have gone through trauma in their own right are usually most ripe to perpetuate that trauma on somebody else. And I think that the key really to stopping that cycle of violence is recognition. I feel like in a lot of instances, especially within the Jewish community, but really on a global level, I feel like people who have undergone trauma in their own life don't really know what to do with it. And in many, many instances, the most comfortable thing to do with it is to sweep it under the rug. And it's something which I've sadly found quite a bit within the observant Jewish community is, because of our tremendous love for people and our tremendous hope that people recover, we tend to sometimes brush with very broad strokes around people who have issues and use these very general sweeping terms of, you're okay, at your core you're a good person, don't let these things define you, you should never assign a label to yourself, you're okay. Whilst the sentiment behind that idea I think is noble and very, very positively motivated, I feel like it takes people who have issues that need to be dealt with, and it allows those issues to be swept away. And when those issues are swept away, they have this funny habit of never staying away. They will come back, guaranteed they will come back, and they will stake their claim to what they want out of your life. And I think that's what allows that cycle of violence to continue. What those people need to hear is, this is not your fault. And you should feel no guilt and no shame for what you've gone through, but you need to acknowledge the help that you need to get, and you need to acknowledge the process that you need to embrace. You really need to embrace and take seriously. And that doesn't take you away from being a good person and all that, but I feel like really the key to people deciding that they're where that cycle stops really is recognition and acceptance and acknowledgement of what they've been through, what they need to do to take care of that. And that's really where that violence stops. To your second question about, is there any room, I think you use the term compassion, Razy, is there any room for compassion? So this is a real, kind of not really a pet peeve, but this is an issue that I feel very strongly about. So, statistics also show that 93% of children that are sexually abused in our country are abused by someone near and dear to them, for lack of a better term, someone who they know personally well, in a certain sense, that might have a very intimate relationship with, a family member, a caretaker who's in the home. And that is, literally more than 9 times out of 10, the reality. The reason why I think that's so important, that's so misunderstood, is because I feel that there are a lot of organizations and there are a lot of very well-intended people that, in their desire to protect children from this terrible, terrible disease, go out of their way to demonize sexual predators. And they want everyone to believe that sexual predators are monsters. They're half human beings. They are the scum of society. They are, they are ill and deranged and evil, and so on and so on and so forth. I think the problem that creates is, what if you're someone who was abused by somebody you love? What if you are somebody who was abused by someone who you live in the same home with still today, and you engage with them regularly, and you are convinced that you and them really have a great relationship? How can those two different realities be congruent? How can that person whom you still have a positive relationship with be a monster. They're not a monster in your mind. They're your brother. They're an uncle. They're someone who's very near and dear to you. You know, in the past 3 weeks, I've had the experience of being in touch with 3 different young women, all of whom were abused by an older brother. And all of them, bar none, have all suffered from this reality of not really being able and ready to accept what has happened to them, because their brother's not a monster. And therefore they don't understand it. And so I think that as a society, I feel it's important that we use the right terms to give people an understanding of who commits these sorts of acts, who commits these sorts of crimes. They are not necessarily done by monsters. They are sometimes done by people who are very near and dear to us. That does not make their actions excusable in any way, shape, or form. That does not diminish the responsibility that they need to take for their actions. But I feel that a proper understanding of how so many of these dynamics unfold would really benefit a lot of people.
Yeah, if it's a sibling, that makes it a lot harder to go public about it. It makes it a lot harder to get your full family support, because there's obviously 2 sides and they love and care about both. So that would definitely make it more difficult. You mentioned that in order to really be able to work on yourself, you have to confront face to face your past and what you went through. You have to really not ignore it. So what are you currently doing to support victims and help them out with this? What role do you play in their healing process?
So right now it's kind of informal. You know, my story has been spread on a number of social media channels, and I make an effort for, you know, to leave a personal email address on all of those channels in case, you know, people want to reach out. And it's becoming more and more common. You know, I'll get contact in any, you know, way, shape, or form from people who find themselves in a similar situation. You know, by and large, the people that reach out personally are in the Chabad community, in the observant Jewish community, from other Hasidic sects, whatever the dynamics are. And, you know, I think they feel now, or how I felt a couple of years ago, that there's no place for them. There's no place for a survivor of sexual abuse in the Chabad community, in the Vishnitz community, in the Satmar community, in any sort of observant community, and they feel out of place. They don't know what to do with themselves. They can't foresee themselves living the life that they had always envisioned and imagined with their past. And I'm there to share with them I guess a message of resolve and of hope and of faith, and, you know, most of all, to help them discover the courage within them. I think that, you know, through my experiences, I've had the ability and the good fortune to meet some of the most remarkable human beings, many of whom reached out to me for help and ended up being, you know, as beneficial as I was to them, if not more. And, you know, it's a constant process. I think that, you know, it's been often said by people in the field that being a survivor of childhood trauma is the loneliest experience possible. And I feel like, you know, really it is incumbent on those of us that have gone through it and are fortunate to have strong support dynamic to be there for others, and to be that, you know, pillar of hope and strength that we wish that others could have provided for us so many years ago. And you know, Rezi, like you mentioned before, to really stop that cycle and to help people, you know, get a hold of themselves and figure out the courage that is within them, and to help them pass that message forward.
Well, you definitely did it. You have a beautiful family, and to the outside, you are definitely thriving. And I think inside, you're also. We didn't talk much about your family. Your wife, Shana, is a wonderful, special person. Could you tell us a little bit about, firstly, how Shana handled this whole thing? Not easy. She got married thinking that her husband was a regular Lubavitch yeshiva student, and, you know, into her marriage found out this very difficult past that you had. So firstly, tell us a little bit about that, and then share with us just in general what you and Shana do in Salt Lake City as the rabbi in Rebbitzin for Jewish young professionals.
Sure. This was and is, and, you know, it's like, as I mentioned, I think it's an ongoing process for everyone involved. This was very difficult for my wife. You know, and Reza, I think you put it very, very well. In our circles, you know, you meet someone young in life and you decide to spend the rest of your life with them, and you grow old together, and there's a lot that you learn together. And I think that at no point in her wildest nightmares did my wife ever imagine that her husband would come to her one day and disclose to her that he had been sexually abused for a very long time. It rocked my world. It rocked her world. It rocked the world of so many of our family members. And I'd say that it's a continuous process for both of us. There's a lot of healing and accepting that I think goes into this on both parts. And I'm very fortunate that, whilst my wife Shayna has been dealing with whatever she needs to deal with on her own, she's also had the ability to be, a tremendous source of support and strength, and really was there for me through very challenging times. And I think that, I'm a firm believer that everyone goes through their process and takes the steps they need and does the things they need to do. And I think that the same applies to my wife and to, everyone in my family and everyone that's affected by this sort of experiences. Everyone takes their time, they do it at their pace, they take the steps that they need, and they find the results that they want. And we're each fortunate in our own way to have our support circles and to have the support that we need. And yeah, it's a lifelong process in that sense. What we do here in Salt Lake.
But I just want to say that I heard the song that Shayna composed for you while you were going through the trial, and it was really so powerful and so beautiful, and really showed what a true, rock. She's there for you with just such strength, love, and support that she really supported you throughout the whole way. So that was really, really beautiful.
I would agree. As to our activities in Salt Lake, the rabbi was kind enough to bestow a whole bunch of directorships on me earlier when he introduced me. So yes, we do a whole bunch of things here in town. Most importantly, my wife and I have the honor of directing young Jewish professionals, the community here for young adults in their 20s and 30s, grad students, first jobs, young families, that sort of thing. Up until recently, Utah had a very dynamic economy, and it was thriving and booming and growing. And now, COVID put a little bit of a pinch into that. But we hope and have every expectation that it'll be back and as strong and vibrant as ever. A year ago, we opened Utah's first all-Jewish preschool, which we're very proud of and we're very thankful to have. And yeah, it's in addition to the work that I'm fortunate to do in this arena, I have a full-time job, and our community definitely keeps us busy and challenges us and helps us grow and gives us tremendous opportunities. And for that, we're very, very thankful.
Okay, we are going to go live to questions. Thank you, Rabbi Zippel, for that incredible story of courage and inspiration and faith. It's on the one hand so painful to think of, but on the other hand, it's a totally different mind shift and way of thinking of this challenge than I've heard in the past. And so this was very inspirational for me. Before we go to questions from the community, and if you wrote in a question, we are going to call upon you to ask your question live directly to Rabbi Zippel. So be prepared to ask that question. If you haven't written in a question, feel free to write in a question or just open up your mic after we've called on the different people that have written in. This is also true for those of you who are joining us on Facebook. Write in your questions now. We will call on those questions to make sure that we are asking your questions on Facebook.
If your question is private by nature and you do not want to be called upon to ask it, instead of publicly chatting it, just send it to us privately and we'll read it for you instead of calling upon you to ask.
Before we get started with that, Rabbi Zippel, if someone would like to support your efforts, your causes, the things that you care passionately about, Chabad in Salt Lake, supporting survivors of child sexual abuse and other people who are experiencing trauma, how could they support you? What could we do as a community to help you do the good work that you're doing?
Well, you mentioned earlier, if anyone wanted to financially support, I would appreciate that, and I'll put the link here below for our Chabad activities. We are working through the process of starting a foundation of sorts, particularly for those sorts of activities, and I'll share that with your community at a later opportunity. But I think that beyond that, I think when you use the term support, I think there is a real powerful message that a takeaway message, if I could share with the members of your community. A comment that I'll get very often when I share my story with people is, this is definitely not what we expected. You know, a lot of people don't envision, you know, the kind of the poster boy for speaking out about male sexual abuse being an Orthodox rabbi who lives in Salt Lake City. And I guess the takeaway message that I would share with people who have that thought and that perception, which I appreciate, and I trust me, I know where you're coming from, is to really never discount what somebody else is going through in life, and to really accept and understand, you know, everyone's got their peckle, everyone's dealing with something, everyone is, you know, might be having a good day or a challenging day or whatever it is. And I would say that, you know, being someone that often surprises people in that arena, the one thing I would encourage every human being on the face of the earth is to be there for other human beings, be a listening ear, be someone of support for someone who might need it on a particularly challenging day, and really, you know, realize the human dynamic, what people go through, and you know, make every effort to be there for people, for human beings going through the human experience to the best of your ability.
Wow, thank you very much for that. Again, so inspirational. So we got a question that came in privately, so we won't announce who it was that asked. If you would like to come on mic and ask your question publicly or ask another question, feel free to do so. Question is, were you the only one of the children in your household who was sexually abused?
As far as we know, my siblings have all, you know, been asked that question multiple times, and they've all said that they were not abused. If you poll 10 different child forensic psychologists, you'll get 10 different deeply based, scientifically researched answers, if that is common or not common. And everyone has their own theory, if, you know, if sexual predators latch onto one victim, and how common that is. But to date, as far as we know, I'm the only survivor that has come out about my abuser. And that's it. Yes, I guess the answer to your question is yes.
I hope that it remains that way.
I hope so too.
Another question that came in was, thank you so much for answering the call to speak up. I am an inpatient psychiatric nurse to adolescents. Over 50% of my patients have been sexually abused. What do you think are the most important things I can do for this group of patients while they are in my care?
Inpatient psychiatric patients. The most important thing that you can do for young people who have been abused, and clearly the abuse has taken such a toll on them that they are in inpatient psychiatric care, I would say is to give them their space. And I don't mean by distancing yourself from them, but to recognize what they're going through. I think that, you know, I remember when I first saw my therapist, one of the first questions I asked him is, how long is this going to take? You know, I'm having knee surgery in a couple of days, and I think we're all, you know, I assume all you Jackson people, you all ski or hike or bike. You know, you all know an orthopedist, and at some point you get a boo-boo and you go to the doctor and you say to the doctor, okay, doctor, what's the prognosis? And the doctor says, okay, I'm going to fix you up. You're going to be on crutches for 2 weeks, and then you'll do physical therapy for a couple months. And come the winter, you'll be good as new. You'll be fixed. You won't have to see me regularly anymore. I will not be a regular part of your life. And I went to my therapist and I asked him exactly that. When am I going to be fixed? Like, what's the nature of our relationships? How long am I going to see you? You can give me some pills. You can give me some homework. What's going to be? And he shared with me, he was as direct as I was with him, he was as direct with me, and he told me it's not quite the way it works. He's not going to wave a magic wand and say some incantation and fix me. I was going to have to accept that this was going to be a lifelong journey that I was going to contend with. And for someone who's dealing with patients in that, you know, raw and intensive a setting, I would say, realize what they're going through. Realize, you know, for a lot of them, they're probably in a situation where they have been informed that they're going to be dealing with this sort of situation for the rest of their lives. And it's a very long time, the rest of your life. And give them that space to process, allow them to come to grips with that. In a situation like that, no one wants to hear you're going to be okay, because it doesn't feel like that. It doesn't feel like you're going to be okay. And I would really allow people that space and that respect to process that.
Our next comment has come in from Facebook, and if you have questions on Facebook, please post. Alex Shapiro writes, proud of Rabbi Avrami for the strength to use his experience as a springboard to help and inform others. We do have another question that has come in privately. I read that your abuse started when you were 8 years old and continued for a decade. As you became older and a teenager, why weren't you strong enough to emotionally and physically do something about it? I ask this question most respectfully.
I appreciate that. And that is a very good question. The reason why I think it's a very good question is because it's a question which I've asked myself for a very, very, very long time. I've often shared with people that when I first came forward, even when I went to the police for the first time, there's a certain point where speaking about your sexual abuse gets very uncomfortable. So it's never comfortable to speak out about your own sexual abuse, period. In any setting, to any group of people, in person, over Zoom, it always takes a little bit of a toll on you. That being said, it was less uncomfortable to speak about being sexually abused at age 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, but it's uncommon in a certain sense, and it's very awkward to speak about being sexually abused as a young man by an older woman when you're 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. And I guess the clinical answer to the question, which I really needed to grapple with, is that it's important to understand the kind of the neurological effect that sexual abuse has on a person. When someone is in that sort of dynamic, their brain begins to function differently than most other human beings. One of the books that I was given to read right in the beginning of my therapy was a tremendous book, which I encourage anyone who really wants to understand the dynamics of trauma, called The Body Keeps the Score, about the effects of trauma on one's mind, heart, and soul. And it was so crucial for me to read that to really gain a proper clinical understanding of the pathways in your brain that get altered when you experience something like this as a child, as an early teen. And so the answer to your question is, I wasn't a healthy and functioning teenager at that point. I did not have the capacity and the capabilities and the tools and the strengths to deal with things as you and I now would understand those belonging to, quote, a normal, healthy teen, to a normal 16-year-old, quote unquote. And so it's a great question. It's one that I've often struggled with. And the short answer was I couldn't. I had that ability taken away from me, not by force, not by coercion, but by trauma. Trauma is a reality which leaves a very lasting impact behind, and it robs us in many instances of our most innate abilities to protect ourselves.
Thank you very much for that question. We are going to allow, there's one more question that was posted. I'm not going to read it. If you have a question, and I will read it if we don't get questions in the next minute or in the next 10, 15 seconds, but if you have a question and would like to come on mic, go ahead, ask your question publicly. We would love to allow for a dialogue between our community members and Rabbi Zippel. Malka, I see you came on mic. What is your question?
I wanted to ask Rabbi, since this became public, did any other children or male, female come out that particular person abused, or was that due to a close relationship within the household?
So Malka, the answer to your question is no. But I want to, that's the short answer. I do want to elaborate on that just for a second, because for me, it was a very, very helpful experience. My abuser eventually went to trial. The trial was a pretty intense experience unto itself. The defense attorneys, in their great wisdom, decided to focus on exactly that point that you just brought up. If no one else came forward, why should we believe that this is true? And the prosecutor in my case believed that that line of questioning allowed the jury, in my case, to have a very, very powerful understanding into really, how the grooming and sexual abuse of a child works. I mean, on a very basic level, she made the Ted Bundy argument. Serial killers do not kill every human being they ever came in contact with. We consider someone a serial killer, I think, if they've committed more than 3 killings in a certain time span. That's considered that in that time span they've interacted with thousands of people. Someone is not a serial killer just because they kill everyone they come in contact with. And so there was that very basic dynamic. But what my prosecutor felt was a very crucial learning opportunity for a lot of people in this case is the ability to understand and the need to understand that, people don't do this out of boredom. People don't do this out of spite. People don't do this, it's a crime of opportunity. People do this because of a certain imbalance that exists in their own lives, and they seek to impart that imbalance on someone that comes across their path. And oftentimes that's one person or it's multiple people, but she felt it was a very, very powerful opportunity to really provide context into how these sorts of dynamics and these experiences and relationships come about.
And what kind of punishment is the trial is over, correct?
Yes.
So
Yeah.
was she incarcerated? What
she will be in jail for a very, very, very long time.
Thank you
Utah
very
has-
much for that. Thank you, Malka, for your
He's
question.
also saying something Utah has what?
No, just on a basic level, Utah has a concept of indeterminate sentencing. So in the state of Utah, when someone has a criminal trial, the judge does not impose a fixed amount of years at any sort of criminal trial. The judge provides a window, from this many years up until a certain amount of time. And so my abuser will be incarcerated from anywhere between 25 years to life. So a very long time.
Thank you very much for that. Kamea, would you like to unmute yourself?
She did.
Please go ahead.
I did. Rabbi, thank you for sharing this. I know it can't be easy no matter how many times you do it. I remember reading your story a while ago, and it's moving, and I'm just so impressed that you were able to speak out and do this. My question comes from being a parent. I'm a parent, and I can't imagine how I would feel if anything like this happened to my child. I'm sure your parents are racked with guilt because not only because this happened to you, but because it happened to you by someone who they brought into the home. How are your parents dealing with the whole situation? How do you feel, are you having to help your parents by telling them it's not their fault? Are you also trying to heal them while trying to heal yourself? I just was wondering what that dynamic is like.
Thank you for that. That's a great question. I think that this is a question which speaks to a reality where a number of truths can all exist at once. The funny thing about guilt is that guilt often exists in a place where we know that it shouldn't belong, and yet it parks itself there. So yes, I would think it's pretty accurate to say that my parents feel very guilty about what happened. Yes, I think it's also fair to say that my parents realized that there's not really anything they could have done to stop this, and this isn't their fault, and this certainly is not a situation which they should feel guilty about. So I think you put it very well. I think a large part of my healing was the recognition that this was not something which my parents had done. And whilst I understood that, it was something which I could share with them as well. And like I said, it's one of those dynamics where you know that something is not necessarily true. You feel guilty about it regardless. You convince yourself that you should not feel guilty about it. And yet, as we all know, on some days we feel guilty about things that we know not to feel guilty about, but yet we still feel guilty about them. And so, yeah, it's a tricky dynamic. I can't begin to imagine what that must be like for my parents, how I would feel, God forbid, if my kids went through something like this in some form, God forbid. And yeah, Razy mentioned my wife before, you mentioned my parents. The reality is that this is an issue that affects dozens of people all at once. At my abuser's trial, my prosecutor gave such a powerful reference. She said, oftentimes people think that sexual abuse is a gun. at one point, one person points at another, sexual abuse is a bomb. And when it goes off, it affects families, cities, communities. You know, it's not just a one-on-one harm. And so it's a recovery process for all of us, and we all take the steps that we can to heal all together.
Remy didn't share too much about his parents, but his parents are some of the most, aside from loving, caring, and devoted people, Remy's mother, Sharon, is, you know, a helicopter mother. She knows what every child is doing at every moment. She has everything, even with her children married, she knows what's going on, but they're very, very close to each other. We're talking about a very healthy family dynamic and really loving, caring, and incredible people. So I just want to insert that because Remy didn't mention it and people might be thinking, well, was the home personal? Was there neglect? Was there something that was missing out? And so I just wanted to add that.
And it's important to make that point. You know, this did not happen due to any sort of irresponsibility or you know, any lack of care, God forbid, on my parents' part. And I think that if you know, as Razy said pretty correctly, my mom was a helicopter mom, and I tell people, you know, if that could happen in my house, it could happen in any house. And I think that is, you know, the message that I shared earlier, that you know, you can't guarantee to 100% protect your children from ever coming in contact with someone like this. I think the opposite is the effort that needs to be made, is providing that sort of setting for your children to feel that comfort to come forward and speak up about anything.
We've got time for one last question, but I am going to insert one question before that last question. In today's day and age, there's much more of an openness and talk. There's even like great Jewish books about your private parts, about your body parts, about touch that's not okay, about who's not allowed to touch you or see you and stuff like that. Is that something that's changed a lot that you think can help prevent sexual abuse in today's day and age that wasn't so much talked about when you were growing up?
Yes. I do feel, I think those books do a remarkable job, and I can tell you as a kid, that did not exist in my day and age. So that's definitely, you know, our community making steps and making an effort to acknowledge these issues. In my humble opinion, I feel that there's the last page in that book is missing. And the last page in that book is, what do you do if something actually happened to you? So much of that book is preventative care, is, you know, don't let this happen, don't let that happen, don't let this happen, don't let that happen. This is safe. This is and scream and shout if someone tries to touch you. What happens if you didn't? What happens if you didn't scream and shout and someone touched you and is regularly putting you in that sort of situation? I think that's the last page in those books, which needs to be included, you know, not just preventative care, but also care after the fact, giving our kids the tools to deal with this, God forbid, in the instance that something does happen.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to look to see if anyone wrote in any questions over here on Facebook that we haven't gotten to. We do have quite a group of people that are watching us on Facebook. Someone writes, they are the best, love, 2 minutes ago. I think she's talking about the books.
Or your parents.
Or your parents. Eva Kiviat Brown.
That
maybe.
would be a reference to my parents, yes.
Okay.
Hi, Mora Eva.
Very well. So we have time for one more question. I did see that Stephanie came on camera moments ago. Maybe you had a question that you wanted to ask. If you do, please feel free to come on. If you haven't yet asked a question and would like to ask a question, please unmute yourself. If you don't want us to see you, feel free to ask your question without going onto camera, but unmute yourself and just fire away. We have time for one more question from the community. Otherwise, if you don't speak up, we will go back to anyone who has already asked a question and allow for them to ask another one since,
Can you talk more about the silver lining?
Yeah, hi. I just wanted to add something, Rabbi Zippel.
Yes.
I commend you, your courage to speak out, and the bravery that you have. It's unbelievable. I actually come from New York, and I'm a therapist in New York, and there's a high incidence, unfortunately, of childhood sexual abuse also in the Haredi community there. I also want to add one more thing, and that is with the Holocaust survivors. You know, they always talked about the emotional abuse and the physical abuse, but unfortunately, the Holocaust survivors also, you know, sustained a lot of sexual abuse, and they will never talk about it. It's been covered up. And finally, you know, a few have opened up, but it's rare. And I think that's something that needs to also be addressed. I mean, I don't know how you feel about that, or you've even thought about that, but what are your thoughts on that?
I have heard about that. I have heard about that being a dynamic that very often doesn't come to the fore due to the immense amounts of other traumas that people of that generation went through. I think as a society, we're changing. You know, when I came forward last February, one of the more difficult conversations that I had was with a person here in this community who's in his 70s at this point, I want to say, and he was abused in school 60 odd years ago. And it was painful to hear. I had kept the secret for 15 years at that point. It made, you know, it gave me the shivers to imagine having to keep that quiet for 60 years. And I'm grateful that he had the opportunity to share that with one person. I'm happy for him. I'm glad he had that chance, because I know that there are people of those earlier generations, you know, either survivors or children of survivors, of Holocaust survivors, that, you know, that's a reality for them. And so I completely agree with you. And I really hope that, you know, those that are still with us have the opportunity and the fortune to speak up and find that comfort.
We had one more question, Rabbi Zippel, if you still have time for one more.
Sure.
I think will allow for us to end on a very inspiring note. The question came in from Leah Schnall. She writes,
Ask her to go on.
Leah, would you like to come on mic and ask the question yourself?
Unmute yourself.
Hi, sorry, my camera's off. Thank you so much for this inspirational and powerful and empowering presentation, and incredible just vulnerability and willingness to share such honest thoughts with all of us on your experience and journey. I think it's incredibly empowering, and you know, you should be blessed to be a continued source of strength to everybody's lives that you are touching. And I'm sure that that is expanding way beyond just the small audience of those people that are coming your way and that you're hearing from. And it's just so incredible and unbelievable. And I have utmost admiration for everything that you've shared here. And I seriously holding my breath watching these questions just be shot at you with no advanced preparation on deeply personal and intimate experiences. And you've shared incredible inspiration and perspective on that and insight. So thank you.
Thank you.
You mentioned this concept of feeling like you've come to a place of reaching a silver lining, of being able to observe, experience the edges of a silver lining in this. And I was just wondering if you can elaborate more on what some of that silver lining is about and what you're seeing.
Sure. Yes, this is a good way to end. So I have the good fortune of being a shliach, of being a Chabad rabbi, of being someone who attempts to live my life perpetuating the legacy and the vision of the Rebbe, and you know, and using the Rebbe's message of Avas Yisrael, of unconditional love for each and every single Jew, to be the guiding force in my life. And in Chabad, we often talk about this term of shlichus, of being an emissary. And usually I think we understand the term shlichus to be a geographic concept. So, you know, Rabbi and Razi a number of years ago picked themselves up and moved to Jackson to serve the Jackson community. It was a geographic move. And my parents did that 28 years ago to Salt Lake, and my wife and I did it a number of years later. And now there's couples, you know, moving to every far-flung corner of the world. It's a geographic shlichus. It's a geographic mission of serving a community. And the Rebbe taught us that when you encounter a void, when you encounter something which can benefit from you, that's a message. That's a lesson. Serve that void. Fill that void in a way only you can. And like Rabbi and Razi do in Jackson, and me and my parents and my wife do here in Salt Lake City, we try to fill a void. Well, I consider myself very fortunate that I have found another void in life to fill. And I think that was something that the Rebbe taught us very often, is that when you encounter a situation in life that you are uniquely positioned to serve that situation, to make a difference in that situation, you need to consider that situation that you have encountered as a direct message from God that this is your calling. And I think finding that calling, finding that situation where you can feel that you're making a difference, that no one else is making that difference, is a tremendous gift. It leads to incredible fulfillment. And I think it's something which, we crave as human beings. On a biblical note, one of my favorite passages in all of Torah is in the Megillah, in the story of Purim. We read about this very, very dramatic back and forth between Mordechai and Queen Esther. In the immediate aftermath of Haman's decree, Mordechai is aware of the decree, Esther is not, and Mordechai is imploring Esther, she needs to go to the king and beg for the king to spare her people. And Esther comes back to Mordechai with an extremely rational response, and that is, I can't. It's not socially acceptable. It's not how the palace works. It can't be done. How else can I make this plain to you? This cannot happen. This will not happen. This is not allowed to happen. And in very poetic words, Mordechai responds to Esther. And what I love about this encounter is Mordechai doesn't attempt to rationalize with her and tell her why what she has said to him is somehow wrong or incorrect or factually off base. He doesn't come back to her and say, oh, no, come on, really, it's okay. It's really not so bad. He comes to her and he says to her, listen, the Jews will experience salvation in this instance somehow or another. Somehow the Jewish people are going to be rescued from this situation. That is a certainty. What you need to figure out is this your moment, or is this going to be somebody else's moment? So all of the objections that you've raised are correct. It's true. You can't just walk into the king's inner sanctum, and you haven't been summoned, and you might get your head chopped off. All these things are correct. What you need to think to yourself now is this going to be your moment or someone else's? And if it's yours, grab that moment. Let that be your moment. And I think about that a lot. I think about all of the doubts and the anxiety that I had before I began this journey. What's everyone going to think of me? What's everyone going to say about me? Is anyone going to believe me? Is it going to make any sort of difference? I probably should keep my mouth shut. No one's done this before. And the response to that voice is not one that answers all that questions. The response to that voice is, you have an opportunity to serve. Do that. Let that be your moment. Someone else will end up doing it. So let it be your moment. Let it be your opportunity to serve your community, serve your people, and make a difference in the world in the way only you can. And I think to do that is truly fulfilling. So Leah, that's the silver lining that I found.
Thank you. Beautiful. Thank you so much.
Powerful. Thank you very, very much to all of you for joining us. Please put your hands together for Rabbi Zippel for an exceptional, inspiring presentation. Please put your hands together. That was
Thank you.
That was inspiring. That was deeply emotional and raw. Really very, very special. For those of you who would like to support Rabbi Zippel, please, Rabbi Zippel has posted his website where you can go and support his work in Utah, yjputah.com/donate. For those of you who would like to support our local community during these challenging times, jewishwyoming.com/donate. Thank you from the bottom of our hearts, Rabbi Zippel. Any closing remarks?
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate your receptiveness to the message, and let's keep spreading the light. So thank you very much.
Rabbi Zippel, if there's somebody that maybe is going through something similar and they would want to reach out to you personally, what would be the best way to do so?
So I'll post, I have an email address, which is, pretty much specifically for this topic. I'm going to post it here in the chat box. Obviously it's completely confidential. And by all means, I encourage people to reach out. If it's a question, if it's a thought, I know that I'm only where I am today due to the selflessness of many survivors that have come before me. And I feel that the least that I can do as a human being is pay that forward. So I've posted the email address. Please feel free to reach out.
Just saying this so that those on Facebook know it as well. It's Avremi's Story. So Avremi, AVREMIS, and then story@gmail.com. Avremi's Story@gmail.com.
Have a wonderful night, everyone. Great to see you all. Take care.
Thank you so much.
Bye, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Great to see everyone. Take care. Have a great night. Be well. Thank you. Thank you. I can't hear you, Malka. I can't hear you. How do you unmute? There you
I unmute. Thank you. Thank you for bringing such a powerful
Stop the recording.
program. And yeah,